My name is Adelaide Finch. For 42 years, I was an archivist, a keeper of quiet histories tucked away in acid-free boxes. My work was a study in patience, in the careful preservation of things others might discard: letters, photographs, brittle manuscripts that held the faint, papery scent of a life already lived. I learned that every story has a structure, a spine, and that to protect it, you must first understand its delicate composition. I have been a widow for 8 years now. My husband, Thomas, was a man who understood structure better than anyone I knew. He wasn't an archivist, but a gardener. He saw the world in terms of root systems, soil composition, and the unwavering promise of a season's turn. Our home in the little coastal city of Port Blossom was his masterpiece, a modest clapboard house surrounded by a symphony of his own making, climbing roses that scaled the porch trellis, a vegetable patch that yielded more tomatoes than we could ever eat, and a magnificent Japanese maple that stood like a silent guardian by the front walk. After he was gone, the house grew quieter, but his presence lingered in the order he'd left behind. I kept his garden as he would have, my hands learning the rhythms he had taught them. I found a certain peace in the repetition, in the feeling of cool soil under my fingernails and the reliable scent of damp earth after a morning rain. It was my archive of him. My life settled into a new kind of order, one built around my children. I had two, Isabel, my eldest, and Julian, her younger brother. They were grieving, of course, each in their own way. Isabel, ever the pragmatist, channeled her sorrow into ambition, climbing the ranks at a high-end marketing firm with a ferocity that left me breathless. Julian, my gentle, soulful boy, drifted. He was a musician, a poet of chords and melancholy lyrics, but the world had little patience for his art. I tried to be the anchor they'd lost. When Isabel and her husband, Robert, wanted to buy a condominium in the city's newly developed waterfront district, their down payment was short. I remembered Thomas saying, "Our security is for their future, too." I wrote the check without a second thought. When Julian's student loans became a weight he could no longer carry, I paid them off. It was, I told myself, an investment in his peace of mind. He moved into the small apartment above our detached garage, a space we'd once intended for guests. "Just until I get on my feet, Mom," he'd said. That was 6 years ago. The requests became expectations, then assumptions. I paid the tuition for my granddaughter, Sophie, to attend a private preschool with a focus on the arts. I covered the bill when Isabel's designer handbag contained everything but her wallet at a family dinner. I was the silent, reliable fund, the ever-present safety net. I didn't mind. It felt like mothering, an extension of the role I had always known. I loved them. It was as simple and as complicated as that. But over time, a subtle shift occurred, a slow erosion I failed to notice until it was almost too late. The thank yous grew faint, then disappeared entirely. My presence in my own home began to feel peripheral, like a familiar piece of furniture, useful, dependable, but rarely seen. I had become part of the house's structure, a load-bearing wall they no longer had to think about. They just knew it would hold them up. The kettle whistled softly as I reached for the mugs. The morning light hadn't yet touched the window panes, but my body didn't need the sun to know it was 5:30. After a lifetime of early starts, I still woke before the birds. The house was quiet, just the way I liked it. I moved through the kitchen with the fluid economy of habit, 2 scoops of coffee, a splash of oat milk, the ceramic click of the spoon against the cup. I didn't hear Sophie's little feet. She was always light on them, more whisper than child when she walked. When I turned, she was already sitting on the edge of the kitchen stool, her legs swinging gently, still in her colorful constellation pajamas. "Grandma," she said, her voice a secret. "Mommy and Daddy said they're going to borrow your forever money tonight." My hand stilled mid-stir. The air in the kitchen shifted, became heavier somehow. I forced a smile, the kind of placid mask adults wear when they don't want a child to know their world has just tilted on its axis. "That's a silly thing to say, sweetheart." "What do you mean?" She shrugged, her small shoulders rising and falling, and reached for a cracker from the jar on the counter. "I don't know. I was supposed to be asleep." They were talking in the study. "Daddy said you didn't need it all, and Mommy said she would help you organize it." I crouched beside her, my knees protesting faintly, and brushed a stray curl from her face. Her skin was so soft, so new. "You didn't dream this, little star?" "Nope." She went back to crunching her cracker, the sound unnervingly normal. I was hiding under the blanket, but I could hear them. Mommy had papers. I stood slowly, gripping the cool quartz of the countertop just long enough to steady myself. My heart was beating too hard for someone who hadn't moved more than 10 feet. Forever money. That was what Thomas and I had called our retirement savings, a silly name we'd invented one night while poring over statements at this very kitchen table. It was a promise we'd made to each other, a promise of comfort and independence in the quiet years. A promise I had kept to myself. Sophie finished her snack, hopped off the stool, and ran off toward the living room, humming a little tune from her music class. I poured the coffee, though I no longer wanted it. The bitterness rising in my throat had nothing to do with the dark roast. By the time Isabel walked in an hour later, heels already on, phone already in hand, I'd packed my fear away into a neat, hidden compartment, the way an archivist files away a fragile document. She breezed through the kitchen like it belonged to her, dropping her dry-cleaning receipt on the counter without a word and opening the fridge with one hand while tapping out a message with the other. "Morning, Mom," she said, her voice bright but distant. I passed her the travel mug I'd already prepared, black, just how she liked it. She took it without looking up from her screen. "Can you pick up Sophie from school today?" she asked, finally glancing at me. "Robert has a client dinner, and I'm showing 2 properties in the Pearl District after 5. I nodded, the motion so practiced it was automatic. "Of course, dear." She offered a brief, tight smile. "You're a lifesaver," she said, and then she was gone. The front door closed with that careful, muffled click she always used when she was running late. I leaned against the sink and looked out the window. The garden still held the shape Thomas had given it, the raised beds for the vegetables, the stone border along the hydrangeas. He dug every inch by hand the year after he retired, back when we believed we'd have 20 more springs together. Instead, we got 2. After he passed, I thought my primary role was to absorb the shock for everyone else. I sold the little lake house we'd loved, using a portion of the money to help Robert when his first investment venture failed. Isabel didn't like the word bailout, she called it recapitalizing. I had spent years tending to my family, pruning back my own needs to let them flourish. But as I stood there, clutching a mug of coffee I couldn't drink, I had the chilling realization that perhaps I had cultivated something else entirely. Something that saw my garden not as a place of beauty and memory, but as undeveloped land, ripe for the taking. Sophie's words echoed in my mind. "Mommy said she would help you organize it." It sounded so reasonable, so helpful, so dangerous. Later that day, I was on my way to put fresh towels in the upstairs bathroom when I heard their voices again. Isabel had come home early. The door to the study, Thomas's old sanctuary, was ajar. I didn't mean to linger in the hallway. Not exactly. But the sound of Robert's voice, low and clipped, caught me. "She's not getting any younger, Isabel," he said. "If we don't step in now, she could lose it all to some scam or just mismanage it. It's a liability." Isabel responded, her tone softer but no less pointed. It was the voice she used with difficult clients, a soothing balm over a sharp hook. "We are not stealing from her, Robert. We're protecting her assets. And ours, by extension. She doesn't need that much liquidity just sitting in a savings account. It's not smart. It's not safe." There was a pause, the kind that carries the weight of unspoken agreements. And then Robert added, "And we could actually put it to use. That portfolio is just sitting there like a museum piece. The equity in this house alone." I stood perfectly still, the stack of clean towels pressed tight against my chest. My heart thudded once, hard and slow, like it was deciding whether to break or to fortify itself. "Once she signs over power of attorney, it'll make everything easier," Isabel said, her voice now crisp with strategy. "We'll frame it as giving her peace of mind. She probably won't even notice the day-to-day changes." The towels slipped a little in my arms. I waited until their voices softened into indistinct murmurs, then backed away down the hallway, my footsteps careful, practiced. I returned to the kitchen, folded the towels neatly on a chair, and started wiping down the stovetop, though it was already clean. My hands moved out of habit, but my thoughts were elsewhere, drawing invisible lines between Sophie's innocent whisper and the calculated plan I had just overheard. They weren't planning to ask me. They were planning around me. I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage either. Not yet. What I felt was something sharper, steadier, an alertness that hadn't stirred in years. It was the same quiet instinct that once told me when a child's fever was rising before the thermometer confirmed it, the archivist's instinct that knew when a story was being subtly, deliberately rewritten. Something was coming. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized I would have to be the one to write the next chapter myself. That night, after the house had settled into its evening quiet, I called Beatrice. Beatrice and I had been friends since our sons were in kindergarten together. She was a retired journalist, sharp and unsentimental, with a mind that cut through nonsense like a hot knife through butter. She didn't say hello when she picked up. She never did. "What's wrong, Adelaide?" she asked, her voice raspy. She could always hear the shift in my breathing. I told her everything, my voice low so it wouldn't carry through the floorboards. Sophie's whisper about the forever money, the conversation I'd overheard in the study, the subtle, creeping sense that I had become a utility in my own home. When I finished, there was a short silence on her end, punctuated by the faint clink of ice in a glass. "Well," she said, her tone as dry as autumn leaves. "They're not protecting you, Adelaide. They're circling." I opened my mouth to argue, to offer a defense for my children born of habit and a mother's stubborn love, but nothing came out. Part of me had already known it. "Check your accounts," she said, her voice all business. "Everything. Bank statements, investments, your will. Anything you ever gave them access to, even casually. Take it back." "I don't think they've taken anything yet," I whispered. "Yet," she repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "But they will. And they'll convince themselves, and try to convince you, that they're doing it for your own good. It's the oldest story in the book." I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone warm against my ear, and looked across the room at Thomas's old mahogany desk. The original copy of our will was in the top drawer, the one we'd drafted together, full of hopeful, loving clauses. "Isabel said something about helping me organize things," I murmured, the words tasting like an excuse even to my own ears. Beatrice snorted. "She'll call it organizing. Robert will call it strategy. But once your name is off the documents, Adelaide, you'll never get it back. They're counting on you being too polite, too accommodating, to stop them." I didn't want to believe it, but I trusted Beatrice's cynical clarity more than I trusted my own weary optimism. "You need to act before they do," she said firmly. "Get a lawyer. Quietly. Don't announce a thing. Start with that desk." The line went quiet for a moment, just long enough for me to hear the distant, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the downstairs hall. It sounded like a countdown. The next morning, I went to see Julian. I found him in the garage apartment, a melody taking shape under his fingers as he sat with his worn acoustic guitar. The space was warm and quiet, smelling faintly of old books and the lemon oil he used to polish his instruments. He looked up when I entered, a fleeting smile on his face that quickly faded when he saw my expression. He set the guitar aside. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay?" I sat down on the edge of his unmade bed. "Julian, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me." He nodded, his eyes wary. "Okay. Do you know what Isabel and Robert are planning?" He paused, just long enough for the answer to announce itself. It was the kind of pause where the truth stands just behind the teeth, waiting for permission to emerge. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses on his fingertips. "They said you might need help," he mumbled. "That you've been forgetting things." "Have I?" I asked, my voice even. "No," he said it so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "I don't think so. But they talk about it a lot. Isabel says she's worried." I waited, letting the silence press on him. He was a good man, my Julian, but he had always bent under pressure, especially pressure from his sister. He depended on this rent-free roof over his head, on the occasional loan from me that we both knew was a gift. His complicity was born of fear, not malice. I knew the habit well. They're talking about a family meeting, he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. Soon. Maybe this weekend. They want it to seem casual, but they're going to ask you to sign some things. A power of attorney, they said. Just in case. I sat beside him, the mattress dipping under my weight. And what did you say? I didn't say yes, he whispered, his gaze fixed on a loose thread on his jeans. But I didn't say no either. Mom, I don't want to lose them. If I speak up, if I take your side, Isabel will. She'll freeze me out. You know how she is. I'm not asking you to take sides, Julian, I said gently, my heart aching for his predicament. I'm asking you to see clearly. He finally looked up, meeting my eyes. In them, I saw it all. The fear, the shame, the conflict. But I also saw a flicker of something else, something stronger just beneath the surface. A line that hadn't yet been crossed. I'll be there, he said, his voice small but firm. When it happens. I nodded, feeling a small, essential piece of the puzzle click into place. We sat together for a few more minutes, not saying much. The quiet between us was filled with everything that had been left unsaid for years. That night, Sophie came to me again. This time, there were no crackers, no humming. She crawled into my bed just after 9, clutching her favorite worn blanket, a patchwork quilt I had made for her when she was born. She looked unusually serious. She just climbed under the covers and curled up beside me, her small body a warm weight against my side. Couldn't sleep? I asked, putting my arm around her. She shook her head against my shoulder. Mommy and Daddy were talking again. My chest tightened. I waited. They think your brain isn't working right, she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. Daddy said if you don't sign the papers, he'll tell Dr. Coleman that your memory is broken. The words settled into the room like fine, gray dust, impossible to sweep away. I felt my hands go cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Sophie kept talking, her voice a hush in the dark. He said doctors believe stuff like that when grown-ups say it about old people. I closed my eyes, but the darkness behind my lids was filled with a terrible clarity. My thoughts were loud now, clattering through every memory of recent weeks. Every time Isabel had said, "Are you sure you didn't forget, Mom?" Every time Robert had laughed a little too easily when I'd hesitated mid-sentence. They weren't just planning to control my finances. They were building a case against my mind. They were preparing to have me declared incompetent, to erase me quietly, legally, with forms and witnesses and manufactured concern. Sophie rolled over to face me, her eyes too wise for her 7 years. I don't think your brain is broken, Grandma. I don't either, my love, I said softly, my voice holding steady even as my pulse hammered against my ribs. Are they going to make you leave? She asked, her lower lip trembling. No, sweetheart. My voice was a fortress, built of a resolve I didn't know I possessed. They can't make me do anything I don't want to do. She tucked her head under my arm again, her breathing eventually evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. But I lay awake until the sky turned a pale, pearly gray. I kept hearing Thomas's voice from a conversation we'd had the month before his heart gave out. We'd been watching a documentary about an elderly artist whose children had sold off his life's work. Promise me, Adelaide, he'd said, taking my hand. If it ever comes down to choosing between being kind and being safe, you choose to be safe. Kindness won't protect you from a wolf who's learned to wear a sweater. That morning, I called Beatrice again. I need the name of that lawyer, I said, my voice clear and calm. The one you called a shark. A shark in a sensible tweed suit, Beatrice corrected. Her name is Judith Price. I'll text you the number. She's expecting your call. Isabel's text arrived on Thursday morning. Family dinner Saturday. Just us. Don't worry about cooking, we'll handle everything. She added a smiling emoji, a small, cheerful glyph that felt more menacing than a threat. By Saturday evening, the dining table had been set with a care I hadn't seen in years. Linen napkins, the good silver, candles flickering with a soft, celebratory glow. Robert brought in takeout from Aperture, that overpriced new bistro downtown, and announced it with a flourish, as if he'd spent the day braising it himself. Julian sat stiffly at the far end of the table, his eyes fixed on his water glass. Sophie was at a sleepover at a friend's house, conveniently out of the way. We made it through the salad course on a thin gruel of small talk before Isabel put her fork down with exaggerated gentleness. "Mom," she began, her voice infused with practiced sincerity. "There's something we've been meaning to talk with you about." I met her gaze, my own face a placid, neutral mask. I had spent 2 days preparing for this moment. "Oh, it's just, well, we've noticed lately that things might be getting a little overwhelming for you. The house, the bills, keeping track of everything." Robert chimed in, leaning forward with an earnest expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We've been thinking, maybe it's time to let us help more. Just to ease some of the pressure. We want you to be able to relax and enjoy your retirement, not worry about quarterly tax payments and portfolio management." Isabel reached into her stylish leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I watched it land on the polished wood of the table between us. It made a soft, definitive sound. "These are just some simple documents," she said lightly, pushing it toward me. "Power of attorney, mostly. It just gives us the ability to handle things on your behalf if you ever need it. Nothing changes unless you want it to. It's just for peace of mind, really. A safety measure." I picked up the papers. My hands, to my surprise, were perfectly steady. I turned a few pages, my eyes moving across the dense legal jargon without really reading it. I knew what it said. Judith Price had walked me through a similar document, pointing out all the ways it could be used to strip me of my autonomy. I let my hands tremble, just slightly, as I set the folder down. I looked from Isabel's hopeful face to Robert's expectant one. I let a flicker of confusion cross my features. Isabel's voice softened, becoming a gentle caress. "There's no pressure, Mom. We just love you. We want to make sure you're protected." I nodded slowly, looking at the folder as if it were an impossibly complex puzzle. "It's a lot to take in," I murmured, my voice intentionally vague. "I'd need some time to look this over." "Of course," Robert said, a little too quickly. He refilled my water glass, an act of solicitous care that felt like an insult. After dinner, I thanked them politely, promised to think about it, and even managed a frail smile. Then I walked straight upstairs to my room, the manila folder in my hand. I didn't lock my door. I no longer needed to. The locks I had put in place were far more powerful than a simple deadbolt. The appointment with Judith Price had been illuminating. She was a woman in her late 50s with intelligent eyes and a handshake that inspired confidence. She didn't once speak to me like I was fragile. That alone made me trust her. "You're not being paranoid," she'd said after listening to my story without interruption. "You're being prudent. The law, unfortunately, is full of pathways for well-intentioned children to do enormous damage." We had spent that first afternoon rewriting my will and establishing a revocable living trust. My assets were still divided equally among my children, but my control, was now ironclad. We added clauses, clear language protecting my independence and outlining specific instructions should anyone attempt to contest my cognitive capacity. I revoked the old medical proxy Isabel had pushed me to sign years ago. Instead, I named Julian as my primary agent, with a crucial stipulation: if he was ever pressured or felt unable to act in my best interests, he could decline, at which point control would pass directly to my attorney, not to another family member. When I told Judith I had chosen Julian, she raised an eyebrow. "He hesitated," I explained. "But he didn't lie to me. In this story, that's worth everything." Next, I had gone to the bank. It felt like a clandestine operation. I changed every password, enabled two-factor authentication on every account, and set up alerts for any transaction over $50. I closed the old joint savings account Thomas and I had once shared with Isabel, an account she hadn't touched in years, but which still represented a vulnerability. I opened a new one in my name alone at a different bank. Each step was a quiet act of reclamation. I was archiving myself, ensuring the original documents were secure. Now, sitting at Thomas's desk, I slid the documents from Isabel's folder and placed them next to the new, notarized documents Judith Price had prepared for me. One set represented their version of my future. The other represented mine. The petition arrived by certified mail 2 weeks later. Isabel had wasted no time. She had filed for legal guardianship, citing concerns about my cognitive decline, my erratic memory, and my increasing dependence on others. She attached a letter signed by Robert, full of vague, self-serving anecdotes about my supposed confusion over bills and appointments. There was a list of incidents, none of which had ever happened. I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't even feel angry. What I felt was a profound and sorrowful clarity. The story they were trying to write about me was now a matter of public record. Judith Price moved quickly. We gathered our own archive of evidence, my updated medical evaluation from a geriatric specialist Judith had recommended, which declared me to be in excellent mental and physical health. Notarized bank records showing my competent management of my own finances, even a glowing letter from Sophie's teacher, confirming my punctuality and engagement. Julian provided a sworn affidavit, his statement concise and truthful, detailing the conversation about the family dinner and the pressure he had felt from his sister. He had chosen, at last, to see clearly. The courtroom was a cold, sterile place, all polished wood and muted colors. Julian sat beside me, his shoulders tight but his gaze steady. When they called him to testify, his voice shook only once, when he looked at his sister and said, "She didn't need help. She needed respect." Isabel wouldn't meet my eyes. She kept her attention fixed on her lawyer's table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Robert sat behind her, a silent, grim-faced supporter. He let her take the lead, just as he always did. When it was my turn, I stood straight and told the truth plainly. I did not speak of betrayal or heartache. I spoke of my life, my routines, my finances. I spoke of Thomas's garden and the plans I had for it next spring. I presented my story, not as a victim, but as the archivist of my own life. I said nothing to humiliate them, just enough to show the court that I knew precisely who I was and what was mine. The judge, a woman with tired, discerning eyes, did not deliberate for long. She denied the petition in full, her voice sharp with disapproval as she noted the lack of any credible evidence. I watched Isabel's face drain of color as the ruling was read. Her eyes didn't fill with tears. They filled with something far worse, the flat, hard look of realization. The battle she had initiated was over. She had lost. But the fracture she had created in our family, the deep, foundational crack, would not be so easily mended. Later that evening, I sat in the garden alone, a cup of chamomile tea growing cool in my hands. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the tomato vines and painting the sky in strokes of lavender and rose. I looked at the house, at the warm light glowing in the windows. It was my home, and I had fought for it. But it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a monument to a battle I had never wanted to fight. I began to wonder what it would mean to start over, to archive this chapter of my life and begin a new one. The house sold faster than I expected. "It has good bones," the agent said, smiling. I smiled back at that. I had spent a lifetime tending to those bones, holding them together long after Thomas was gone. The process of packing was a slow, meditative archaeology of my own life. I sorted through a lifetime in pieces, Thomas's reading glasses, still in their case on his bedside table, a box of Sophie's finger paintings from preschool, the old, dented tea tins that still smelled faintly of Earl Grey and cinnamon. Each object was a story. I chose which ones to keep, which ones to place carefully in the archives of memory, and which ones to let go. I moved into a small cottage in a quiet, beautifully maintained retirement community just outside of town. It wasn't grand, but it was flooded with light. French doors opened from the small living room onto a private patio, with just enough space for a narrow garden bed. The entire place was clean, simple, and blessedly, unequivocally mine. No one dropped off dry cleaning here. No one left passive-aggressive notes on the fridge. No one assumed I would pick up their slack or fund their ambitions. My time was my own. My resources were my own. My peace was my own. I planted tomatoes in the garden bed out back. Thomas would have teased me about the spacing, said I never gave anything enough room to breathe. But they came up anyway, slow, stubborn, and resilient. A bit like me. Sophie visits every weekend. Her parents drop her at the community gate, a silent, awkward exchange that I do not force into anything more. Sophie runs to me, her arms wide. She brings me drawings, stories from school, and always insists on checking the progress of our tomatoes. She calls the garden hers and mine, and I let her. Julian comes by on Wednesday afternoons. He doesn't say much about what happened. Neither do I. The words are unnecessary. He brings coffee from a local roaster, sits with me on the patio, and sometimes he plays his guitar, soft, searching melodies that fill the small space. He is rebuilding himself, and in our shared quiet, we are rebuilding something between us, too. It is a slow, careful process, like coaxing a fragile seedling to life. Isabel has not called. Neither has Robert. I am not waiting by the phone. I have found that my life is surprisingly full without them. I take long walks along the community's winding paths every morning. I drink my tea without rush. I read entire books without interruption. Some days I don't speak to anyone but the birds and the woman who works at the front gate. Those are good days, too. I don't feel invisible anymore. I don't feel small. I feel like myself, Adelaide Finch, a woman who understands the value of a well-preserved history and the importance of authoring her own future. I hadn't realized how much of her I had lost until I remembered what it felt like to be seen, most importantly by myself. And when Sophie wraps her small, strong arms around my neck and whispers, "You're my favorite person in the whole world, Grandma," I believe her. Not just because she is a child who loves her grandmother, but because I know now that I am a person worth choosing.